I never thought I'd stand in the ashes of someone else's cruelty and realize I was still breathing. But that's exactly where I found myself the night Kalen's men set fire to my apartment, tried to erase me like I was nothing more than a mistake in his perfect life. My name is Alexius, and I've seen enough years to know that some stories don't end the way you expect. This one, it starts with a divorce that should have been the end, but turned out to be just the beginning of something far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The day Alara signed those papers, I watched her hand shake as she held the pen. Not from fear, though God knows she had every reason to be afraid. No, her hand shook because somewhere deep inside, she still loved the man sitting across from her, the man who was smiling like he just won the lottery. Kalen Mercer, self-made billionaire, tech entrepreneur, the golden boy of New York's elite circle. He looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife like she was expired merchandise he was finally getting rid of. "Sign it, Alara," he said, not even bothering to hide the impatience in his voice. "Let's not drag this out longer than it needs to be." The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, slid the final page across the mahogany table. Around them, the conference room of Mercer and Associates gleamed with success, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan like the whole city belonged to him. Maybe it did. Kalen had built an empire in 5 years, turning a single tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. He had everything except mercy. Alara's signature came out shaky but legible. The moment the pen left the paper, Kalen stood up, straightening his $1,000 suit jacket like he was shaking off something dirty. "Hi, viewers. Kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story." "You'll be out of the house by tomorrow," Kalen said, his tone flat and businesslike. "Security will escort you if necessary. Don't take anything that isn't explicitly yours. I've had inventory done." Alara looked up at him, and for a moment, I thought I saw something break behind her eyes. Not her spirit. No, that was still intact, stubborn and fierce as ever. It was something else. Hope, maybe. The last dying ember of it. "I never wanted your money, Kalen," she said quietly. Her voice had this quality to it, like wind through autumn leaves. Soft, but with an edge that could cut if you weren't careful. "I wanted you." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Well, you can't have me. I'm marrying someone who actually understands what it means to be part of this world. Someone who doesn't embarrass me at every business dinner with her small-town values and her pathetic attempts to fit in." The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably, but said nothing. This wasn't his first rodeo with ugly divorces, and it certainly wouldn't be his last. But even he seemed to wince at Kalen's words. Alara stood slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. She was wearing a simple blue dress, nothing fancy, nothing that screamed for attention. That was always her way, understated, genuine, real in a world full of plastic. She pulled off her wedding ring, that thin gold band she'd worn for 3 years, and set it on the table with a soft clink. "Goodbye, Kalen," she said. He didn't even watch her leave. He was already on his phone, probably texting his new fiancée, the one with the Instagram following and the model contracts. The one who knew how to pose for cameras and laugh at the right jokes at cocktail parties. But here's the thing about that moment, the thing that nobody saw except me, because I make it my business to notice what others miss. Alara's hand went to her stomach as she walked toward the door. Just for a second, a protective gesture so quick and subtle you'd miss it if you blinked. And her face went pale, not from sadness, but from something else entirely. Pain. Physical, immediate pain that she was trying desperately to hide. The court official, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, noticed too. She leaned over to whisper something in Kalen's ear, something that made him pause mid-text and look up with a smile that could only be described as predatory. Whatever she'd said, it pleased him immensely. Alara made it to the elevator before she had to lean against the wall, one hand still pressed to her abdomen, the other clutching her small purse like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just tilted sideways. I followed at a distance, watching, waiting, doing what I do best, bearing witness to the moments that change everything. She didn't cry. Not in that elevator. Not in the lobby. Not even when she walked out into the harsh afternoon sunlight with nothing but a suitcase she'd left in her car that morning, knowing she wouldn't be going back to the mansion she'd called home for 3 years. But I knew, even if she didn't want to admit it yet, even if she was fighting it with every fiber of her being, something was desperately wrong. And whatever Kaylin had just learned from that court official, it was about to make everything so much worse. What secret do you think the court official whispered to Kaylin that made him smile like that? The thing about family is that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones sharpening the knives. Rowan Mercer learned that lesson too late, and it cost him everything. But before we get to how it all fell apart, you need to understand what happened 3 days after that divorce was signed, when Alara tried one last time to say goodbye to the only person in that cursed family who'd ever shown her kindness. Rowan was dying. Not the peaceful, slip away in your sleep kind of dying. No, this was the slow, agonizing kind where your body betrays you piece by piece while your mind stays sharp enough to feel every moment of it. He'd been the steel backbone of the Mercer Empire once. Built it from nothing in the 70s when a handshake still meant something. Now he was 87 years old and confined to a hospital bed in the east wing of the mansion, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed like mechanical vultures waiting for their meal. Alara drove to the mansion that Thursday morning, her old Honda struggling up the winding driveway lined with oak trees that had probably cost more to transplant than most people's houses. She hadn't slept in 2 days. The pain in her stomach kept coming in waves, sharp and insistent, but she pushed it down, buried it deep where it couldn't stop her from doing what needed to be done. The security guard at the gate recognized her, hesitated for just a moment before his radio crackled to life. "Mrs. Mercer is here to see Mr. Rowan Mercer," he said into the device. The response came back fast and cold. "She's not Mrs. Mercer anymore. Turn her away." Alara heard it through the open window of the guard shack. She closed her eyes, steadied her breathing, and when she opened them again, she looked at the guard with such quiet dignity that he actually flinched. "Please," she said. "He's dying. Just let me say goodbye." Maybe it was the crack in her voice, or maybe the guard had a grandmother somewhere who taught him that some rules were meant to be broken. Either way, he picked up his phone instead of his radio, made a call directly to Rowan's nurse, and 5 minutes later, Alara was being escorted through a side entrance, away from the main house, where Kaylin was probably conducting business meetings without a single thought for the old man wasting away 3 hallways over. Rowan looked like a ghost when she walked into that room. His skin was paper-thin and yellow, stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too close to the surface. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had seen wars and recessions, and the building and burning of empires, they were still bright when they landed on her. "Alara," he whispered, and even that one word seemed to cost him. "You came." "Of course I came," she said, pulling a chair close to his bedside. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling in her lap. "You asked me to." He had asked through the nurse, through a phone call that came at 2 in the morning when desperation outweighed caution. Rowan knew his grandson had forbidden any contact, but when you're counting your breaths, you stop caring about tyrants, even if they share your last name. "I don't have much time," Rowan said, struggling to lift his hand. Alara took it gently, and I watched something pass between them, some understanding that didn't need words. "I need you to know that I tried. I tried to fix what he broke, but he's too far gone. Too much like his father. God rest that miserable soul." "Don't tire yourself," Alara said softly. "No." His grip tightened with surprising strength. "Listen to me, girl. There's a letter, sealed, in the blue book on that shelf." He tried a gesture, but couldn't quite manage it. "Take it. Keep it safe. Don't let him." The door burst open so hard it hit the wall. Kaylin stood there in his suit, face red with fury that made his features ugly and twisted. "Get out," he said to Alara. Not shouted. That would have been too crude for Kaylin Mercer. No, he said it with the kind of cold certainty that comes from always getting what you want. "Security." "Kaylin, please," Rowan gasped. She's nothing." Kaylin cut him off. "She's a nobody who married into this family and couldn't even manage that right." "Alara." You have 30 seconds to leave this house before I have you arrested for trespassing." Alara stood slowly, never taking her eyes off Rowan. The old man's mouth moved, forming words she couldn't quite hear over the blood rushing in her ears. But his eyes went to that bookshelf, desperate, pleading. She moved fast, faster than Kalen expected. Her hand closed around the blue leather-bound book, felt the envelope tucked inside, pulled it free, and shoved it in her purse in one smooth motion before two security guards grabbed her arms. "Don't you ever come back here," Kalen hissed as they dragged her toward the door. "He's not your family anymore. He never was." They hauled her through the mansion, past marble sculptures and crystal chandeliers worth more than small countries, past the life she'd briefly thought would be hers. Out the front door, down the steps, across the driveway to where her car sat like a rusted insult among the Bentleys and Teslas. One of the guards, younger than the other, bumped into her deliberately as they let her go. She stumbled, caught herself on her car door, and didn't see his hand slip in her purse, didn't feel the weight difference when he pulled the envelope free and tucked it into his jacket. Alara got in her car with shaking hands and drove away, not knowing that the letter Rowan had risked everything to give her was already gone. And back in that hospital room, Rowan Mercer clutched his chest, gasped once, twice, and then the machine started screaming their terrible song. What do you think was in that stolen letter that Kalen wanted to keep hidden? There are some kinds of pain that don't have names, at least not the kind you can say out loud without feeling like you're breaking into pieces. Alara discovered this truth on a Tuesday morning when the world tilted sideways, and she found herself on the bathroom floor of her cramped studio apartment, unable to breathe through the agony tearing through her abdomen like barbed wire. She'd been ignoring the symptoms for weeks. The nausea, the dizziness, the way her body felt like it belonged to someone else. When you're busy surviving the wreckage of a destroyed marriage, you don't have time to pay attention to little things like your own body staging a rebellion. But this wasn't little anymore. This was fire and ice, and every nightmare she'd ever had compressed into one endless moment of pure terror. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, a 70-year-old woman who made the best dumplings in Queens and minded everyone's business like it was her job, heard the thud through the thin walls. She had a key for emergencies, and thank God for nosy neighbors, because she's the one who found Alara curled on the tile, barely conscious, and called 911 without wasting a single second on questions. The emergency room at Mount Sinai was organized chaos, all fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell, and people moving with practiced urgency. Alara drifted in and out, caught fragments of conversations between nurses and doctors, heard words that didn't quite make sense floating around her like debris from shipwreck. When she finally came back to full consciousness, there was a doctor standing beside her bed. Dr. Sarah Martinez, her badge said, and she had kind eyes but a serious mouth that told Alara this wasn't going to be good news. "Ms. Hayes," the doctor said gently, using Alara's maiden name. She must have seen the divorce papers in Alara's wallet when they were checking for ID. "You're stable now, but we need to talk about what brought you in." Alara tried to sit up, but her body protested. "I just need some pain medication. I'll be fine." "You're pregnant," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "About 11 weeks. The room went silent. Not the peaceful kind of silent, but the kind where all the air gets sucked out and you're left gasping in a vacuum. Alara stared at the doctor, waiting for the punchline, waiting for this to be some kind of terrible mistake. "That's impossible," she whispered. Kalen and I, we hadn't been close like that in months before the divorce. We were barely speaking. He was already with." She stopped, the timeline suddenly clicking into place with horrible clarity. 3 months ago, that business trip to Boston. The hotel room where they tried one last time to save something that was already dead. The morning after when Kalen had looked at her with such regret that she knew it was truly over. "It's not impossible," the doctor said. "But I'm not going to lie to you, Ms. Hayes. This pregnancy is high risk. Your stress levels are through the roof, you're severely underweight, and you've been experiencing what we call threatened miscarriage. The pain you felt this morning was your body trying to reject the pregnancy." Alara's hand went to her stomach, flat and seemingly empty, but now holding the most dangerous secret of her life. "Can you save it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Martinez sat down on the edge of the bed, a gesture that told Alara this doctor had delivered bad news before and knew how to be human about it. "We could try, but you need complete bed rest, minimal stress, proper nutrition, and constant monitoring. Even then, the odds aren't great. Maybe 60% that you carry to term, and that's being optimistic." 60%. Alara had built a life on worse odds than that. "What if I told the father?" Alara asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it said out loud. "Is the father supportive? Would he help reduce your stress?" Alara laughed, and it came out bitter and sharp. "He'd probably pay someone to make sure I lost it. He's already moved on. New fiancé, new life. A baby would ruin his perfect narrative." The doctor's expression shifted to something that looked like anger on Alara's behalf. "Then don't tell him. Not until you're safe. Not until this baby is safe." Safe? What concept? Alara hadn't felt safe since the day Kaylin first looked at her like she was disposable. They kept her overnight for observation, pumped her full of fluids and vitamins, and whatever else they thought might help a baby cling to life inside a mother who was barely hanging on herself. Mrs. Chin showed up at visiting hours with a container of soup and a fierce expression that dared anyone to tell her visiting hours were over. "You eat this," Mrs. Chun commanded, setting the container on the bedside table. "You too skinny. Baby need food." "You know," Alara asked weakly, "I have 8 grandchildren. I know pregnant when I see it, even when pregnant woman doesn't know herself yet." Mrs. Chun patted Alara's hand with surprising gentleness. "That man, the rich one, he know?" Alara shook her head. "Good. Men like that, they only bring trouble. You keep baby's secret. You keep baby safe. You understand?" Alara nodded, tears finally breaking free to run down her cheeks. She'd been holding them back for so long, staying strong through the divorce and the humiliation and the loneliness, but this tiny cluster of cells that was half her and half the man who destroyed her, this broke through every defense she had left. That night, alone in the hospital bed with machines monitoring both her heartbeat and the faint flutter of another heartbeat inside her, Alara made a decision. She would survive this. Not for herself, because honestly, she didn't care much about her own survival anymore. But for this baby, this accidental miracle that Kaylin Mercer would never control, never use, never destroy the way he destroyed her. She would disappear if she had to. Change her name, leave the city, start over somewhere he'd never think to look. Because one thing was certain, Kaylin could never know about this child. He'd either force her to end the pregnancy or, worse, try to take the baby away from her the moment it was born, just to prove he could, just to own one more thing she loved. But as she was forming these plans, plotting her escape into obscurity, Alara didn't know that back at the Mercer Mansion, Rowan was writing his own plans that would change everything. And she didn't know that the stolen letter in Kaylin's possession right now contained just 3 words that would haunt him. Check her purse. Will Alara be able to keep her pregnancy hidden from the man who destroyed her life? Success looks different when you're standing in it alone. Kaylin Mercer discovered this truth while staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, 40 stories above Manhattan, surrounded by everything he'd ever wanted and feeling absolutely nothing. The merger had gone through that morning. $15 billion, his biggest deal yet, and the financial press was calling him a genius, a visionary, the next Elon Musk. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with congratulations from people who wanted a piece of his success, wanted to be seen in his orbit, wanted to matter to someone who mattered. But the champagne he'd opened tasted flat, and the skyline that usually made him feel like a god now just looked like a collection of buildings full of people who didn't know his name. He loosened his tie and poured another glass, his third, or maybe his fourth. He'd stopped counting somewhere around midnight. The penthouse was silent except for the ambient hum of the city below, 20,000 square feet of minimalist luxury that cost more per month than most people made in a year. Black marble, chrome fixtures, art that was supposedly important but looked like someone had spilled paint and called it genius. Alara would have hated it. The thought came unbidden, unwanted, and he pushed it away with another swallow of champagne. She wasn't his problem anymore. He'd fixed that mistake, cut her loose before she could drag him down any further with her small-town sensibilities and her embarrassing inability to understand how power worked. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria, his fiancée, the upgrade he kept telling himself Alara should have been. At Cipriani with the girls. Join us. We're celebrating you. 3 heart emojis, perfectly placed. Victoria Ashworth, 26 years old, Yale graduate, trust fund baby, Instagram influencer with 2 million followers who watch her live a life of carefully curated perfection. She knew how to dress for galas, how to laugh at investors' jokes, how to be seen without being real. Exactly what he needed in a wife. So why did the thought of joining her make him want to throw his phone through the window? He texted back, "Big day. Need a rest. Have fun." Her response came immediately. "You know, fun anymore. But okay, baby. Love you." He didn't respond. Just set the phone down and pour another glass, watching the bubbles rise and pop like tiny dreams dying. There was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Kalen checked his watch. 1 in the morning. Who the hell? It's open, he called out, too drunk to care about security protocols. Marcus Webb walked in, Kalen's head of security, and the closest thing he had to a friend, though calling it friendship was generous. Marcus was 6'4", former Marine, the kind of man who could kill you with his bare hands but prefer the efficiency of detailed planning. "We have a situation," Marcus said without preamble. "It's 1 in the morning, Marcus. Can't it wait? It's about your grandfather." That got Kalen's attention. He set down his glass and turned from the window. "What about him?" Marcus pulled out his phone, showed Kalen a photo. A hospital monitor, time-stamped from earlier that evening, showing vital signs that were all wrong. Heart rate spiking, blood pressure dropping, oxygen levels in the danger zone. "This was taken 6 hours ago," Marcus said, "right after your ex-wife visited." Something cold settled in Kalen's chest. She wasn't supposed to be allowed in. She got in anyway, had a conversation with him, alone, for approximately 8 minutes before you arrived, and had her removed. During those 8 minutes, she took something from his room, an envelope from inside a book. Where is it now? That's the interesting part. Marcus pulled up another photo. The young security guard, the one Kalen had hired last month because he was cheap and desperate, holding a blue envelope. Tyler intercepted it, brought it directly to me. "I haven't opened it. Wanted your authorization first." Kalen's mind was racing now, the alcohol fog burning off with the clarity of potential disaster. "Where's Tyler now?" "Waiting downstairs. And there's something else you should know. After your ex-wife left, your grandfather's condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctors are saying it looks like he had some kind of episode. Stress-induced, they think. Is he dead? Not yet, but soon. Days, maybe hours." Kalen walked to his desk, a massive slab of walnut that cost more than a car, and sat down heavily. His grandfather was dying. The old man who'd built everything, who'd handed Kalen the keys to an empire and expected him to be worthy of it, was finally letting go. And Alara had been there in those final days, taking something that clearly mattered enough for the old man to risk defying Kalen's orders. "Bring me the envelope," Kalen said quietly. "And Marcus? Make sure Tyler understands that if he tells anyone about this, anyone at all, his career in security is over. Permanently." Marcus nodded and left. 10 minutes later, he returned with the envelope, blue and sealed with actual wax, like something from a different century. Kalen broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper, expensive stationery with his grandfather's shaky handwriting covering it. He read it once, then again, then a third time, because surely he was misunderstanding, surely his grandfather hadn't. But he had, right there in black ink, witnessed and notarized just 3 days ago when the lawyers had made their regular visit. A codicil to the will. A change that gave everything, the entire Mercer estate, the companies, the properties, the trust funds, all of it to Alara Hayes. Not to Kalen, to his ex-wife. The paper included a single line of explanation. "My grandson has become the kind of man I spent my life teaching him not to be. Perhaps loss will teach him what I could not." Kalen's hands shook as he set the paper down. Rage bubbled up from somewhere deep and primal, the kind of anger that makes people do things they can't take back. Sir, Marcus was watching him carefully. What does it say? It says we have a problem, Kalen said slowly. A very big problem that needs to be solved before that old man dies and this document becomes legal. What kind of solution are you thinking? Kalen looked at the photo Marcus had shown him earlier, the one of Alara being escorted out of the mansion. She'd looked tired, defeated, broken. Exactly how he wanted her. But now she was a threat. The biggest threat to everything he'd built, everything he'd planned. And threats needed to be eliminated. I want you to find her, Kalen said, his voice cold and calculated. I want to know where she lives, where she goes, who she talks to. And I want you to find out if there's any way to make sure this document disappears before it matters. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You're talking about crossing some serious lines here. I'm talking about protecting what's mine. Are you in or out? Marcus had worked for the Mercer family for 15 years. He'd seen things, done things, kept secrets that would destroy reputations and end careers. This was just one more secret, one more problem to solve. I'm in, he said. What Kalen didn't know, what neither of them knew as they sat there plotting in that sterile penthouse, was that back at the hospital where Rowan lay dying, the old man had made one final call before his condition deteriorated. A call to his personal attorney, a man who'd served the Mercer family for 40 years and owed Rowan everything. And in that call, Rowan had said 4 words that would change everything. Protect her at all costs. How far will Kalen go to protect his inheritance from the woman he threw away? Death has a way of bringing people together. At least that's what they say at funerals when they're trying to make something beautiful out of something final. But Rowan Mercer's death didn't bring anyone together. It just revealed how far apart they'd all been standing all along. The call came at 4 in the morning, 3 days after Kalen had read that letter. Alara was awake anyway, had been awake most nights since leaving the hospital, one hand always resting on her stomach like she could protect what was growing there through sheer force of will. When her phone rang with an unknown number, her first instinct was not to answer. Nothing good came from calls at 4 in the morning, but something made her pick up. Intuition, maybe, or just the desperate hope that somewhere in this mess someone gave a damn. Ms. Hayes? A woman's voice, professional but gentle. This is Grace Park from Mount Sinai Medical Center. I'm calling about Rowan Mercer. Alara's heart dropped. Is he? He's asking for you. He's been asking for you for the past 6 hours, but we couldn't reach you until now. Ms. Hayes, I need to be honest with you. He doesn't have much time. If you want to see him, you need to come now. Alara was in her car before she'd fully processed the words, driving through empty Manhattan streets while the city slept, racing against a clock that had already run out of mercy. The hospital let her in through a side entrance, away from security cameras and curious eyes, and Grace Park herself escorted her to the private room, where Rowan lay connected to machines that were doing the work his body had given up on. He looked worse than before, if that was possible. His skin had that translucent quality that comes right before the end, like you could see through him to something beyond. But when Alara walked in, his eyes opened, and there was clarity there, sharp and urgent. Alara, he whispered. His voice was barely audible over the beeping machines. You came. She took his hand, careful of the 4 lines and the bruises from where they tried to find veins that were collapsing. Of course I came. I'll always come when you need me. I don't have much time. Each word cost him. Need to tell you what I did. What I tried to do. Don't tire yourself. Listen. His grip tightened with surprising strength. I changed my will. Everything goes to you. Everything. The estate, the companies, the properties. All of it. Alara went still. Rowan, you can't. Already did. Signed and notarized. You deserve it more than he does. You loved him when he was still capable of being loved. You tried to make him better. He destroyed you for it. Rowan's breathing was labored, raspy. I won't let him destroy anyone else. This is my last chance to fix my mistakes. To fix him. He'll fight this, Alaris said quietly. You know he will. Let him fight. The lawyers are good. Documents are solid. He can't break it, not legally. Rowan coughed, and it sounded wet and terrible. Grace moved closer, checked monitors, adjusted something in his 4. Mr. Mercer, You need to rest, she said gently. No. His eyes never left Alara's face. One more thing. The most important thing. He struggled to pull her closer, his breath hot and desperate against her ear. Protect your child, Alara. He must never know. Never. Alara jerked back, staring at him in shock. How did you? I've lived 87 years, girl. You think I don't recognize the look of a woman carrying a secret? Despite everything, despite dying, Rowan smiled. I see things. I always have. That's why I built what I built. And I'm telling you now, as clearly as I can, Kalen cannot know about that baby. He'll use it to control you, or worse, he'll try to take it from you. Promise me you'll keep it secret. Promise me. Alara's eyes filled with tears. I promise. Good. Rowan settled back against his pillows, and some of the urgency left his face, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. I'm sorry I didn't protect you sooner. I'm sorry I let him become what he became. I thought money and power would teach him responsibility. Instead, it just taught him cruelty. You did your best, Alara said, though they both knew it wasn't true. My best wasn't good enough. His eyes were starting to close, the machines changing their rhythm to something slower, something final. But maybe this will be. Maybe giving him nothing will teach him what having everything couldn't. Grace checked the monitors again, and her expression shifted to something Alara recognized from her own recent hospital stay. The look that said time was up, that the body had made its final decision. Mr. Mercer, Grace said softly, is there anything you need? Anyone else you want us to call? Rowan's eyes found Alara's one last time. Just her. She's the only one who mattered. They sat like that for a while, Alara holding the hand of the only person in the Mercer family who'd ever treated her like she mattered, watching as his breathing got slower, shallower, each breath a little more distant than the last. The lawyers, Rowan whispered suddenly, his eyes flying open with unexpected urgency. Thomas Whitmore. He has everything. USB drive. Evidence. About Kalen. About what he did to me. The medications. The isolation. Make sure Thomas knows. Make sure everyone knows. Before Alara could respond, before she could ask what he meant about medications, about isolation, Rowan's hand tightened in hers one final time. His eyes locked on something beyond her, beyond the room, beyond everything. I see her, he whispered. My Elizabeth. She's been waiting. Then he took one last breath, held it for a moment that stretched into eternity, and let it go. The machines exploded into sound, alarms screaming, lights flashing, medical staff rushing in from the hallway. Grace gently pulled Alara away as they worked, going through the motions they knew were futile but were required to attempt anyway. Alara stood in the corner, watching them try to restart a heart that had simply had enough, and she realized she was crying not just for Rowan, but for everything he'd tried to fix and couldn't. After 15 minutes, they called it. Time of death, 5:47 a.m. Grace walked Alara out through the same side entrance she'd come in through, away from the main hospital where morning shift workers were starting to arrive. At the door, the nurse pressed a business card into Alara's hand. Thomas Whitmore called 20 minutes ago, Grace said quietly. Asked me to make sure you got his number when this happened. He said to tell you that everything is ready, whatever that means. Alara looked at the card. Thomas Whitmore, attorney at law. A phone number, an address in Midtown. Thank you, she managed to say, for everything, for letting me in, for giving us that time. He fought hard to stay alive until you got here, Grace said. That's the sign of someone who had something important to say. I hope you heard what you needed to hear. Alara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and walked out into the breaking dawn. The city was starting to wake up, early commuters heading to jobs they probably hated, delivery trucks rattling down streets. The whole machinery of life grinding forward without caring that somewhere in a hospital room, a man who'd built empires had just breathed his last. She made it to her car before her phone rang again. The screen said Kalen Mercer. Her finger hovered over the decline button, but something, maybe the same instinct that made her answer earlier, made her pick up. He's dead. Kalen's voice was flat, emotionless. My grandfather is dead, and you were there. The hospital just informed me. What the hell were you doing there, Alara? Saying goodbye, she said simply. You had no right. He asked for me. I had every right. There was silence on the other end, the dangerous kind that comes before explosions. When Kalen spoke again, his voice was different. Colder. More calculated. Stay away from the funeral, he said. Stay away from the family. You're not part of this anymore. If I see you anywhere near the service, I'll have you arrested for harassment. Do you understand me? Alara looked at the business card in her hand, thought about everything Rowan had told her, about the USB drive and the evidence and the inheritance that Kalen didn't know was already gone. Understand perfectly, she said, and hung up. She sat in her car for a long time after that, one hand on her stomach, one hand clutching Thomas Whitmore's business card, and tried to figure out how she was going to survive what was coming. Because Rowan's death wasn't the end of this story. It was just the beginning of the war. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse office overlooking Manhattan, Kayla Mercer was looking at his phone with an expression that would have terrified anyone who knew him well enough to read it. Because he'd heard something in Alara's voice, something that sounded suspiciously like hope. And hope in an enemy was the most dangerous thing of all. What evidence did Rowan collect against Kalen? And will it be enough to protect Alara from what's coming? Some funerals are about grief, and some are about performance. Rowan Mercer's funeral was pure theater, and Kalen was the star of a show nobody believed. The service was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral, because when you're a billionaire, even your goodbye needs to impress people. 500 guests filled the pews, Manhattan's elite dressed in designer black, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced sorrow. They hadn't loved Rowan, most of them had never even met him, but they loved being seen at events that mattered, and a Mercer funeral definitely mattered. Kalen stood at the pulpit in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, his face a mask of composed grief that would have won him an Oscar if acting was his profession instead of just his lifestyle. He spoke about legacy and family and the lessons his grandfather had taught him, words that sounded beautiful but meant nothing, empty syllables floating up to the cathedral ceiling like prayers from a man who'd forgotten how to mean them. Victoria sat in the front row, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than most people's rent. She was playing the supportive fiancé role perfectly, knowing that every photographer in the city had cameras trained on this moment, that tomorrow's society pages would feature her grief-stricken face alongside Kalen's, the beautiful couple mourning together. What none of them saw was Alara, standing in the back of the cathedral behind a marble column, wearing a simple black dress and a hat that shadowed her face. She'd come despite Kalen's threats, despite knowing she shouldn't be there, because Rowan deserved at least one person at his funeral who actually missed him. The service dragged on with hymns and eulogies from business partners who talked about deals instead of the man. Nobody mentioned that Rowan had died alone in a hospital room, that his grandson had forbidden his ex-wife from visiting until it was almost too late, that the great Rowan Mercer's final days had been spent more isolated than any man with that much money should have been. When it finally ended, the crowd filed out to a reception at the Plaza Hotel, another opportunity to see and be seen, to network over canapes and expensive wine while pretending to care about the dead. Alara waited until the cathedral was nearly empty before she approached the casket, mahogany and brass that probably cost 6 figures, holding a man who would have preferred something simpler. "I kept my promise," she whispered, one hand resting on the polished wood. "I'll protect this baby. He'll never know. And I'll make sure your truth comes out, whatever it was you were trying to tell me." Touching. Alara spun around. Marcus Webb stood 10 feet away, his massive frame blocking her exit path. He wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, security types with dead eyes and expensive suits. "You were told to stay away," Marcus said, moving closer. "Mr. Mercer was very clear about that. It's a public place. I have every right to be here. Actually, this is a private service, which makes you a trespasser." Marcus pulled out his phone, showed her a photo that made her blood run cold. It was her apartment building, time-stamped. From that morning. "Nice place you've got in Queens. Small but cozy. Mrs. Chun seems like a sweet neighbor. Would be a shame if anything happened to disrupt that peace." The threat was clear, delivered in a tone so casual it made it worse. Alara's hand instinctively went to her stomach, a protective gesture she immediately regretted when she saw Marcus's eyes follow the movement. Are you threatening me? She asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. I'm encouraging you to remember your place. You're nobody, Miss Hayes. You were married to someone important for a brief, unfortunate period, but that's over now. The smart thing to do would be to disappear. Move on with your life. Stop showing up at events where you're not wanted. Before Alara could respond, another voice cut through the empty cathedral. I think the lady has every right to pay her respects. They all turned. A man in his 60s stood at the cathedral entrance, dressed in an expensive but understated suit, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen decades of use. Thomas Whitmore, though Alara didn't know it yet, Rowan's personal attorney and the keeper of secrets that would burn Kalen's world down. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, recognition and wariness crossing his features. Mr. Whitmore, I wasn't aware you were still here. I stayed for the people who mattered, Thomas said, walking down the aisle with the confidence of a man who'd fought bigger battles than this. Ms. Hayes, I believe we have an appointment. If you'd like to come with me, my car is outside. Alara looked between Marcus and Thomas, weighing her options. Marcus was a wall of muscle and barely concealed violence, but Thomas was holding something else, something that made Marcus step back despite his size advantage. We're not done here, Marcus said quietly. Actually, I think you are, Thomas replied. Unless you'd like me to file a harassment report with the police. I have excellent documentation of this entire conversation, thanks to the recording device in my pocket. New York is a one-party consent state, in case you forgot. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Thomas offered Alara his arm like a gentleman from another era, and together they walked out of the cathedral into the bright afternoon sun. His car was a classic Bentley, older than Alara, but maintained with obvious care. The driver, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, opened the door for them without a word. Where are we going? Alara asked as they pulled into traffic. Somewhere safe, Thomas said. Somewhere we can talk without being overheard or followed. Ms. Hayes, Rowan was my client for 40 years, but more than that, he was my friend. He asked me to protect you, and that's exactly what I intend to do. Protect me from what? Thomas pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, held it up so the sunlight caught the metal. From a truth that's about to destroy everything Kalen thinks he owns. Rowan spent the last 6 months of his life gathering evidence, documenting things he'd suspected but couldn't prove until he hired private investigators. What's on this drive, Ms. Hayes, is enough to put Kalen in prison for elder abuse at minimum, potentially attempted murder. Alara's world tilted. What? Rowan's decline wasn't natural. The medications he was prescribed were being altered, dosages changed, pills replaced with placebos or worse. His isolation wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. Kalen wanted him dead, or at least incapacitated enough that he couldn't interfere with business decisions. And he almost got away with it. The car wound through Manhattan streets, heading toward Midtown, and Alara tried to process what she was hearing. Kalen had always been cold, ruthless in business, willing to crush competitors without mercy. But his own grandfather? The man who'd given him everything? Why didn't Rowan go to the police? She asked. Because he wanted to handle it his way. He changed his will first, made sure everything would go to you instead of Kalen. Then he prepared this evidence as insurance, in case Kalen tried to contest the will. He wanted his grandson to have a choice, accept being disinherited gracefully or face public exposure and criminal prosecution. That's not much of a choice. It's more than Kalen gave him. Thomas's voice was bitter. More than Kalen gave you. They pulled up to a nondescript office building, and Thomas led her inside to a conference room on the 12th floor. He plugged the USB drive into a laptop, and suddenly Rowan's face filled the screen, recorded sometime in the last few weeks when he could still sit up without help. Alara, Rowan's voice came through the speakers, stronger than it had been in the hospital. If you're watching this, I'm already gone. I'm sorry for that. Sorry I won't be there to see what happens next. But I need you to know the truth about my grandson, about what he became when nobody was watching. The video played for 20 minutes. Rowan's careful documentation of changed medications, of Marcus Webb following his orders to limit visitor access, of financial documents showing Kaylin had been embezzling from the family trust for years, of recorded conversations where Kaylin discussed accelerating the inevitable with people whose faces were deliberately kept off camera. When it ended, Alara sat in stunned silence. "The will reading is scheduled for tomorrow," Thomas said quietly. Kaylin doesn't know what's in it yet. He thinks he's inheriting everything. When he finds out the truth, when he learns that you're getting the entire estate, he's going to explode. And that's when we need to be ready with this evidence, to make sure he can't hurt you the way he hurt Rowan. Alara looked at her reflection in the black laptop screen, saw a woman who'd been beaten down and discarded, who was carrying a secret that could destroy what little was left of her life if it got out. "What if I don't want the estate?" she asked. "What if I just want to disappear?" Then Kaylin wins. He'll contest the will, drag you through court for years, and eventually wear you down until you settle for nothing. Is that what you want? Is that what Rowan died trying to prevent? The answer was no. Obviously no, but wanting justice and being strong enough to fight for it were two different things. Thomas must have seen the doubt in her eyes because he leaned forward, his expression intense. "Ms. Hayes, I don't know what else is going on in your life right now, what other secret you're carrying, but I do know this. Running away never works. Powerful men like Kaylin, they don't forget. They don't forgive. If you run now, he'll find you eventually. The only way to be truly safe is to take away his power. And Rowan just gave you the tools to do exactly that." Alara's hand went to her stomach again, that unconscious protective gesture she couldn't seem to stop. Tomorrow the will would be read. Tomorrow Kaylin would learn he'd been disinherited. Tomorrow the war would begin in earnest. But tonight, just for tonight, she needed a rest. Needed to think. Needed to figure out if she was strong enough to do what Rowan was asking from beyond the grave. "I'll be at the reading," she said finally. "But after that, after we see how Kaylin reacts, I need guarantees. Protection. Somewhere safe to stay until this is over." "Already arranged," Thomas said, pulling out another business card. "Rowan set up a trust fund specifically for your security. There's a safe house in Connecticut, fully staffed, completely private. You can stay there as long as you need." He handed her the card, and Alara stared at it, this physical proof that Rowan had been planning her escape even while he was dying. What she didn't know, what Thomas didn't know because it hadn't happened yet, was that across the city, Kaylin was making plans of his own. Plans that involved fire and destruction and eliminating problems before they could testify. Plans that would put Alara and her unborn child in danger, far worse than anything she'd imagined. Would the evidence be enough to stop Kaylin, or has Alara just painted a target on her back? The thing about watching your life burn is that fire doesn't discriminate. It takes everything, the good memories and the bad, the things you wanted to keep and the things you were ready to let go. Alara learned this lesson at 2 in the morning when smoke started seeping under her apartment door, and she woke up choking on the smell of her own death. The will reading had happened 12 hours earlier, in Thomas Whitmore's conference room, with Kaylin sitting across the table looking like a king about to claim his throne. Victoria was there too, already planning how to redecorate the mansion, probably her manicured nails tapping against her phone as she scrolled through interior design inspiration. Thomas had been professional, almost cold, as he read through the document. Assets, properties, investments, everything laid out in legal language that took 20 minutes to get through. Kaylin had looked bored at first, confident, barely paying attention because he knew how this story ended. Until it didn't. And the entirety of the Mercer estate, including all properties, businesses, trust funds, and liquid assets, estimated at a total value of $4.7 billion, is hereby bequeathed to Alara Marie Hayes, formerly Alara Mercer, in recognition of her character, integrity, and the love she showed to this family when others showed only greed. The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your bones. Kaylin's face went white, then red, then a shade of purple that would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. "That's impossible," he said, his voice barely controlled. "He wouldn't. He couldn't. It's completely legal and binding," Thomas said calmly. "Signed, witnessed, notarized. Your grandfather was of sound mind when he made this decision. You have the right to contest it, of course, but I should warn you that doing so will trigger the release of certain evidence that Mr. Mercer compiled regarding your treatment of him in his final months." Kalen stood so fast his chair fell over. "You're lying. This is fraud. I'll have you disbarred, I'll." "You'll do nothing," Thomas cut him off. "Because if you push this, if you make me release what's on that USB drive, you won't just lose the inheritance. You'll lose your freedom. Elder abuse is a serious crime, Mr. Mercer, as is embezzlement from a family trust, as is conspiracy to hasten someone's death." Victoria had gone pale, staring at Kalen like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "What is he talking about?" she whispered. But Kalen wasn't looking at his fiancée. He was staring at Alara with such pure hatred that she actually flinched. "You did this," he said quietly. "You manipulated a dying old man, turned him against his own family. You're nothing but a gold digger who finally found the right mark." Alara had stayed silent through the whole reading, but now she stood, met his eyes with a steadiness she didn't feel. "I didn't manipulate anyone. Your grandfather saw who you really are, and he made his choice. Live with it." She'd walked out of that office with Thomas's promises of security ringing in her ears, with $4.7 billion suddenly attached to her name, and with the distinct feeling that she'd just signed her own death warrant. That feeling turned out to be prophetic. The fire started in the apartment below hers, Mrs. Chen's place, which meant it started where someone wanted maximum chaos, maximum confusion about the source. Alara woke to smoke and heat and the terrifying sound of flames consuming everything around her. She rolled out of bed, hit the floor crawling, remembered something from a fire safety talk in elementary school about smoke rising and clean air staying low. Her phone was on the nightstand, but she couldn't reach it. The heat was too intense, the smoke too thick. She crawled toward the door, felt it with the back of her hand like they'd taught her, felt the metal burning hot. The window. She had to get to the window. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, high enough to be dangerous, but low enough that maybe if she could just get outside, get air, she'd have a chance. Her lungs were burning, her eyes streaming tears, and through the chaos and fear, one thought kept repeating. The baby, protect the baby, don't let this end before it even begins. She reached the window, shoved it open, and stuck her head out into the blessedly cold night air. Below her, people were gathering, someone was screaming, fire trucks were wailing in the distance, but they weren't close enough, wouldn't be fast enough. The fire escape. There was a fire escape on the next building over, maybe 6 feet away, accessible if you were crazy or desperate enough to jump. Alara was both. She climbed onto the windowsill, her vision swimming from smoke inhalation, her body screaming at her to stop, to rest, to give up. But giving up meant dying, and dying meant Kalen won, and she'd be damned if she let that happen. The jump was pure instinct, no thought, just desperate motion. She made it, barely, her fingers catching the rusted metal of the fire escape, her body slamming into the building hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. She hung there for a second that felt like an eternity, then pulled herself up and scrambled down the ladder like demons were chasing her. Which in a way they were. She hit the ground just as the fire trucks arrived, just as Mrs. Chan came running up in her nightgown screaming about her cats, just as her apartment windows exploded outward from the heat, raining glass onto the street below. A paramedic tried to put an oxygen mask on her, but Alara pushed it away, her eyes scanning the crowd, looking for Marcus, for anyone who worked for Kalen, for proof that this wasn't an accident. She found it in the form of a man standing across the street, watching the building burn with satisfaction. Not Marcus, but someone she recognized from the funeral, one of the security team. When their eyes met, he smiled, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Alara's blood went cold. They'd done this. Kalen had ordered this. And when they found out she'd survived, they'd try again. She had to run. Now, before the police asked questions she couldn't answer, before hospital records showed she was pregnant, before any of this became more real than it already was. The paramedic was distracted, helping Mrs. Chun sit down, and Alara used that moment to slip away into the crowd. She ran 3 blocks before her legs gave out, collapsed against a brick wall in an alley that smelled like garbage and rain, and finally let herself cry. Not for the apartment or the few possessions she'd owned. Those were replaceable. She cried for the baby inside her, for the stress and the smoke and the terror that had to have affected it somehow. She cried for Rowan, who tried to protect her but hadn't counted on his grandson being this far gone. And she cried for herself, for the girl who'd fallen in love with a man who turned out to be a monster. Her phone was gone, burned in the fire. She had no money, no ID, nothing but the pajamas she was wearing and the knowledge that Kaylin wanted her dead. A car pulled up at the end of the alley, sleek and black, and for a terrified moment Alara thought it was Marcus, thought this was the end. But the window rolled down to reveal Thomas Whitmore's driver, the sharp-eyed woman from before. "Get in," she said. "Thomas sent me. He saw the news." Alara didn't need to be told twice. She stumbled to the car, collapsed into the back seat, and felt herself starting to black out from oxygen deprivation and shock. "Stay with me," the driver said, pulling into traffic with practiced ease. "We're 10 minutes from the hospital. You're going to be okay. You and her baby both." "How did you?" "Thomas knows everything. It's his job. Now breathe slowly, in through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. Keep breathing." Alara tried to follow the instructions, but her body had other ideas. The edges of her vision were going dark. Her limbs felt heavy and useless, and somewhere deep inside, where new life was supposedly growing, she felt nothing. No movement, no flutter, just a terrible, empty stillness that terrified her more than the fire had. "The baby stopped moving," she whispered. "I can't feel the baby." The driver's expression tightened, and she pressed harder on the gas. "Hold on. Just hold on." But Alara wasn't sure there was anything left to hold on to. She'd survived the divorce, survived the betrayal, survived a literal fire meant to kill her. But this, losing the one good thing that had come from her disaster of marriage, this might be the thing that finally broke her. As consciousness slipped away, her last thought was of Kaylin, sitting in his penthouse, probably celebrating what he thought was her death. He tried to erase her, burn away any trace that she'd ever existed, ever mattered. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know because it hadn't happened yet, was that Alara Hayes was about to become the ghost that haunted every moment of his miserable life. And ghosts, as any good storyteller knows, are hardest to kill. Can Alara and her baby survive what Kaylin has unleashed, or has his cruelty finally gone too far? Sometimes justice moves slow, like molasses in winter, taking its sweet time while people suffer and wait. But other times, justice moves like wildfire, consuming everything in its path before anyone can stop it. Kayla Mercer was about to learn which kind was coming for him. Alara woke up in a hospital room that wasn't Mount Sinai, wasn't any hospital she recognized. Private, expensive, the kind of place where celebrities went to avoid paparazzi and billionaires went to keep secrets. Thomas Whitmore sat in a chair by the window, reading a newspaper like he'd been there for hours. Maybe he had been. The baby, Alara's voice came out raspy, her throat raw from smoke. Thomas looked up, and his expression answered before his words did. Alive. Stubborn. Like its mother. The doctors say you're both lucky to be here. Relief hit Alara so hard she started crying again. Ugly sobbing that hurt her damaged lungs, but she couldn't stop, couldn't hold it back. Thomas handed her tissues without comment. Just waited until the storm passed. Where am I? She finally asked. Greenwich, Connecticut. The safe house I mentioned. It's under a shell corporation, completely untraceable. As far as the world knows, you died in that fire last night. Alara sat up too fast, ignoring the way her head spun. What? The fire was clearly arson. The investigators found accelerant in multiple locations. And when they searched the remains of your apartment, they found a body. Thomas's expression was grim. Burned beyond recognition, but approximately your height and weight. Dental records will take weeks to process, and by the time they figure out it's not you, we'll have already destroyed Kaylin. Whose body is it? Does it matter? Thomas's voice was harder than she'd ever heard it. Someone died and a fire meant for you. Someone is dead because Kayla Mercer decided you were inconvenient. That makes it murder, Ilera. First degree, premeditated murder. The newspaper Thomas had been reading was folded on the table, and Ilera could see the headline. Mercer heiress dies in suspicious fire. There was a photo of her apartment building, flames shooting from the windows, and a smaller photo of her from the wedding, smiling like she still believed in happy endings. Mrs. Chun, Ilera asked, suddenly terrified. Safe. She got out with her cats. She's the one who told investigators you were inside, that you hadn't come down. She's devastated, thinks it's her fault somehow. Ilera closed her eyes. Mrs. Chin would mourn her, would probably put up one of those sidewalk memorials with flowers and candles, would tell anyone who'd listen about the nice girl who'd lived upstairs and deserved better than she got. We need to release the evidence, Ilera said. Now, before he tries anything else. Already done. Thomas pulled out his phone, showed her a news alert that was maybe an hour old. Scandal rocks Mercer Empire. Heir accused of elder abuse, embezzlement. The article had screenshots from Rowan's video, had testimony from the private investigators, had enough damning evidence that even Kalen's expensive lawyers couldn't spin their way out of it. The stock price dropped 40% in the first hour of trading, Thomas continued. Every business partner is scrambling to distance themselves. Victoria Ashworth released a statement this morning ending their engagement. The board of directors is calling an emergency meeting to remove Kalen as CEO. It's all falling apart faster than I expected. Ilera should have felt satisfaction, should have felt vindicated, should have felt something other than empty. But watching someone's life implode, even someone who deserved it, didn't feel as good as she'd imagined. What about the fire? She asked. Can they prove he ordered it? Not yet. Marcus Webb has already lawyered up, refusing to cooperate. The man we identified watching the fire conveniently disappeared 12 hours ago. But the investigators are good, and they're motivated. Rich men thinking they can get away with murder tends to piss people off. A nurse came in to check Ilera's vitals, gave her more oxygen, told her the baby's heartbeat was strong and steady. After she left, Thomas moved his chair closer to the bed. You need to decide what you want to do now, he said quietly. You can stay dead, start over somewhere new with a new name and the inheritance safely transferred to offshore accounts. Or you can come back, testify, make sure Kalen pays for everything he's done. Both options have risks. If I stay dead, he gets away with murder. If you come back, you become a target. Again, and next time he might not fail. Ilera's hand went to her stomach, that protective gesture that was becoming automatic. She thought about Rowan, about his final words, about how he'd spent his last moments making sure she'd be safe, about how he'd failed, because safety wasn't really possible when someone with money and power wanted you gone. I want him to know, she said finally. I want him to know that I survived, that he lost, that everything he did to hurt me only made me stronger. Thomas smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. Then let's make sure he finds out in the most painful way possible. Over the next 3 days, while the world thought Ilera Hayes was dead, Thomas Whitmore orchestrated a legal assault that would have impressed Sun Tzu. He filed for immediate transfer of Rowan's estate, citing the emergency circumstances of the heir's apparent murder. He released additional evidence of Kalen's embezzlement, showing he'd been stealing from the family trust for years. He provided the FBI with documentation of money transfers that looked suspiciously like payment for arson. And then, on the 4th day, when Kalen was at his lowest point, when his empire was burning and his freedom was hanging by a thread, Thomas called a press conference. Ilera stood behind a curtain in Thomas's office, watching the live feed on a monitor as Thomas stepped up to a podium surrounded by cameras and reporters. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying that authority that comes from 40 years of winning. I'm here to announce that reports of Ilera Hayes' death were greatly exaggerated. Ms. Hayes survived the fire that was meant to kill her, and she is prepared to testify about everything she knows regarding Kalen Mercer's criminal activities. The reporters exploded with questions, but Thomas held up his hand. Ms. Hayes will not be making a public appearance today for security reasons. But I can tell you that she is alive, she is safe, and she is ready to see justice done. The inheritance that Rowan Mercer left to her will be honored. The estate that Kaylin thought he'd reclaim through murder will never be his. And most importantly, the truth about who Kaylin Mercer really is will finally be exposed to the world. Across the city, in a penthouse that was being seized by federal marshals as evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation, Kaylin Mercer watched that press conference on his phone. His face went through a series of expressions: shock and rage and disbelief, and finally, fear. Because he tried to kill her and failed. He tried to burn away his problems and created a martyr instead. And now she was coming for him with every legal weapon Rowan had left behind. Marcus was already in custody, arrested that morning on arson charges. His lawyers were quietly suggesting he take a deal, testify against Kaylin in exchange for reduced charges. The dominoes were falling, and at the end of the line stood Kaylin Mercer, alone and exposed, with nowhere left to run. But Alara wasn't done. Not yet, because justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about making sure everyone knew exactly what had happened, exactly who was responsible, exactly how far a man would go when his ego got bruised. And that story was just beginning. What will Kaylin do now that he knows Alara survived? And will it destroy what's left of him? Prison doesn't always have bars. Sometimes it's built from public opinion and frozen bank accounts, and the slow realization that every person you thought was loyal was just waiting for you to fall. Kaylin Mercer was living in that kind of prison, and the walls were closing in fast. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed once Marcus Webb decided saving his own skin was more important than loyalty to a man who'd thrown him under the bus the moment things got dangerous. His testimony was detailed, damning, and backed up by phone records that showed Kaylin had explicitly ordered the fire. Make it look like an accident. Marcus testified in a deposition that was immediately leaked to the press. He said she couldn't be allowed to inherit anything, so it would be better for everyone if she just disappeared. The audio recording Marcus had secretly made of that conversation played on every news channel for a week straight. Kaylin's voice, cold and calculating, discussing Alara's murder like it was a business transaction. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Alara watched it all from the safe house in Connecticut, her belly starting to show now, the baby growing despite everything that had tried to stop it. Thomas visited daily with updates that read like a revenge fantasy coming true. The board voted unanimously to remove him as CEO, Thomas reported on day 6. His personal assets are frozen pending the criminal investigation. Victoria is suing him for emotional distress and fraud, claiming he misrepresented his financial situation. Every charity he donated to is returning his money and removing his name for buildings. It's complete social annihilation. What about criminal charges? Alara asked. The DA is building a case for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit arson, elder abuse, and embezzlement. They're talking about 20 to 30 years minimum if convicted. His lawyers are already floating plea deal options, but the DEA isn't interested. They want to make an example out of him. Alara should have felt victorious. This was everything Rowan had wanted, everything she'd survived for. But mostly she just felt tired. When do I have to testify? Grand jury is in 2 weeks. Trial probably won't start for 6 months, standard delays. But your testimony is crucial. You're the victim, the witness, and the heir. You're the story that makes this whole thing make sense. 2 weeks. 14 days to prepare herself to sit in a room and tell strangers about her failed marriage, about the cruelty and the isolation and the fire that nearly killed her. 14 days to get ready to look Kaylin in the eyes and tell the truth about what he'd become. The morning of the grand jury testimony, Alara wore a simple navy dress that hid her pregnancy, pulled her hair back in a professional bun, and applied just enough makeup to look alive. Thomas met her at the courthouse with a security detail that would have been overkill if Marcus hadn't testified that Kaylin had connections to people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. The grand jury room was smaller than she expected, just a table and some chairs and 16 regular people who'd been called to decide if there was enough evidence to indict. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Wu, walked Alara through her testimony with clinical precision. Tell us about your marriage to Kaylin Mercer, Jennifer said. Start from the beginning. So Alara did. She told them about the whirlwind romance, the proposal in Paris, the wedding that cost more than some country's GDP. She told them about the slow change, how love turned to criticism, turned to contempt. She told them about the divorce, about being thrown out with nothing, about Rowan's kindness in her darkest moment. And what happened the night of the fire? Jennifer asked. I woke up choking on smoke, Alara said, her voice steady despite the memories. The apartment below mine was already engulfed. I barely made it out. Later, I learned that Kaylin had ordered it, that Marcus Webb had hired someone to set it, that they'd meant for me to die. Why do you think he wanted you dead? Because I inherited everything. Because Rowan saw who his grandson really was and chose me instead. Because Kaylin Mercer can't stand losing, especially not to someone he thinks is beneath him. The grand jury asked their questions, most of them sympathetic, a few skeptical. But the evidence was overwhelming. Phone records, financial documents, Marcus's testimony, the video Rowan had recorded, all of it pointing to one inescapable conclusion. Kaylin Mercer had tried to murder his ex-wife for money. The indictment came down the next day. 23 counts including attempted murder, conspiracy, arson, elder abuse, embezzlement, and fraud. Kaylin was arrested at what used to be his penthouse, now a sparse apartment he was renting month to month because all his properties had been seized as assets. The photos of his perp walk went viral. Kaylin Mercer in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face showing every one of his 35 years plus 10 more from stress. No smug smile, no arrogant confidence, just a broken man finally facing consequences. Victoria gave an interview to Vanity Fair that hit newsstands the same day. I dated a monster. My time with Kaylin Mercer was the headline, and she spared no details about his controlling behavior, his explosive temper, his obsession with public image over actual human connection. It was self-serving and probably exaggerated, but it was also another nail in his coffin of public opinion. The Mercer empire that had taken 30 years to build collapsed in 3 months. Stock became worthless. Properties were sold to pay legal fees and fines. Employees found new jobs and pretended they'd never worked there. The Mercer name, once synonymous with success and power, became shorthand for hubris and cruelty. And through it all, Alara stayed in Connecticut, growing round with pregnancy, healing from trauma, learning how to breathe without looking over her shoulder every 5 minutes. Thomas handled the business side of the inheritance, setting up trusts and foundations and legitimate structures that would turn Rowan's wealth into something good. Hospitals, scholarships, shelters for domestic violence survivors. Money that had been built on ambition would now be spent on compassion. You don't have to testify at the trial, Thomas told her during one of his visits. She was 7 months pregnant now, moving slowly, her body preparing for the birth that was coming whether she was ready or not. Your grand jury testimony is on record. The prosecutor can use that. I want to, Alara said, watching rain streak down the windows of the safe house. I want him to see me alive. I want him to see that he failed. It could be dangerous. The stress. Everything is dangerous, Alara interrupted. Being married to him was dangerous. Divorcing him was dangerous. Existing in the same world as him is dangerous. At least this way, I get to tell my story on my own terms. So when the trial started in early October, 6 months after the fire, Alara was there. She sat in the witness box in maternity dress that couldn't hide her pregnancy anymore, faced Kaylin across the courtroom, and told 12 jurors everything. His lawyer tried to paint her as a gold digger, tried to suggest she'd manipulated Rowan, tried to imply the pregnancy was a sympathy ploy. But it was hard to make that stick when the prosecution had recordings of Kaylin ordering her death, when Marcus Webb testified about the explicit instructions to make sure she doesn't survive, when the forensic evidence showed the fire had started in 3 separate locations with professional accelerant. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly had enough of entitled rich men, sentenced him to 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 20. She gave a speech about how people in positions of power had a responsibility to use that power ethically, how Kaylin had betrayed not just his family, but the basic social contract that separates civilization from chaos. Kaylin didn't react when they read the verdict, didn't react when they sentenced him, just stared straight ahead like he was somewhere else entirely, like his mind had retreated to a place where this wasn't happening. They led him away in chains, and Alara watched him go without feeling anything at all. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a weary relief that it was finally over. She went into labor that night. Should Alara have testified while pregnant, or did she put her baby at risk for revenge? There's a particular kind of silence that comes after storms, when the wind stops howling and the rain stops falling, and you're left standing in the wreckage trying to figure out what to rebuild. Alara found that silence in a hospital room in Greenwich, holding a baby boy who decided to make his entrance into the world 3 weeks early, as if he too was tired of waiting for life to settle down. She named him Rowan, because some legacies deserve to be honored, and some names deserve a second chance at meaning something good. He had her eyes and her nose, and absolutely nothing of Kaylin visible in his tiny features, which felt like a mercy she hadn't dared to pray for. Thomas visited the day after she brought the baby home to the safe house, which wasn't really safe anymore, but had become home anyway. He brought paperwork because lawyers never stop bringing paperwork, but also a teddy bear that looked expensive and thoughtful in a way that made Alara's eyes sting with tears she was too tired to cry. "The estate transfer is complete," Thomas said, keeping his voice low so as not to wake the sleeping baby. $4.7 billion, properly distributed across trusts and investments and charitable foundations. You're one of the wealthiest women in America, and most people still think you're dead. Can we keep it that way? Alara asked. The dead part, I mean. For a while longer, yes. But eventually you'll need to come back, establish a public presence, especially if you want to be involved in running the foundations Rowan set up. His vision was always about family legacy, about doing good with what he'd built. You're that legacy now. Alara looked at the baby in her arms, this tiny human who had no idea he was heir to billions, no idea his father was in prison, no idea that his existence was the result of one last night when two people who'd stopped loving each other tried desperately to remember how. "What about Kaylin?" she asked. "Does he know about Rowan?" "No one's told him. The birth certificate lists you as mother and father as unknown. Legally, he has no claim, no rights, no knowledge. Just like you wanted. Just like she'd wanted. Just like she'd promised Rowan Sr. in that hospital room when he'd made her swear to keep the baby secret. Kaylin would spend the next 35 years in prison never knowing he had a son, never knowing that the Mercer name would continue through a child he'd never meet. It should have felt like victory. Maybe it would, someday, when the wounds were less fresh and the fear was less immediate. "He's tried to contact you," Thomas said carefully. "Letters from prison. His lawyer keeps submitting them to the court as evidence of remorse, trying to get the sentence reduced. They're quite something. I don't want to read them. I didn't think you would, but I wanted you to know they exist in case you change your mind." Alara wouldn't change her mind. She was done giving Kaylin space in her head, done wondering what he thought or felt or wanted. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences, and that was exactly how it should be. The months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles and the slow, careful work of building a life that felt like hers instead of something that had happened to her. She hired a nanny, Mrs. Chun, who'd lost her apartment in the fire and needed a place to stay anyway. She started working with the Rowan Mercer Foundation, approving grants and visiting the projects they funded, putting a face to the philanthropy. When baby Rowan was 6 months old, Alara held her first press conference. Not as a victim, not as an heiress, but as the director of a foundation that was doing real good in the world. She answered questions about her survival, about the trial, about her plans for the future. She didn't mention the baby, didn't mention that she'd rebuilt her entire life while growing a human, didn't give the media anything they could twist into drama. The Mercer Mansion in the Hamptons, that monument to excess where she'd once lived as Kaylin's wife, became a treatment center for trauma survivors. The penthouse where Kalen had celebrated his deals became affordable housing for single mothers. Every property that had represented his empire got transformed into something that actually helped people. And if that felt like poetic justice, well, Ilera wasn't going to apologize for it. Victoria Ashworth tried to reach out once. A carefully worded email about wanting to apologize, wanting to explain that she hadn't known, hadn't understood. Ilera deleted it without responding. Some people didn't deserve closure, didn't deserve forgiveness, didn't deserve anything except to be forgotten. 2 years after the trial, Ilera got a call from the warden at the federal prison where Kalen was serving a sentence. He'd been moved to solitary confinement after attacking another inmate who'd made a comment about his fall from grace. He was deteriorating mentally. The warden said, barely eating, barely speaking, spending his days staring at walls and his nights screaming about fires and ghosts. "I thought you should know," the warden said, "in case you wanted to visit or send a message, or—" "I don't," Ilera said simply. "Thank you for the update." She hung up and went back to playing with Rowan, who was toddling around the living room with the determined clumsiness of someone just learning how legs work. He laughed at everything, found joy in the smallest things, had no idea that somewhere in a prison cell, his biological father was losing his mind. That's how Ilera wanted it to stay. 5 years after the divorce, Ilera stood at the gates of the Mercer estate, the one property she'd kept instead of transforming or selling. It had been Rowan Sr.'s favorite place, the house where he'd raised his family before everything went wrong, and she'd restored it carefully, bringing it back to what it had been before Kalen's minimalist renovation had stripped away all its character. Young Rowan played in the garden, chasing butterflies with the single-minded focus of a 5-year-old on a mission. Mrs. Chun watched from a bench, knitting something that would probably turn into a sweater nobody needed, but everyone would wear anyway, because that's what family did. Thomas had retired the year before. Finally, after 45 years of practicing law, he still visited monthly, though, claiming he needed to check on his favorite client, but really just wanted to see the boy who carried his old friend's name. "You did good," Thomas said, standing beside Ilera and watching Rowan play. "Both Rowans would be proud." "I survived," Ilera corrected. "That's all I did." "Survive. That's not nothing," Thomas said quietly. "A lot of people in your position wouldn't have. They'd have let the cruelty break them, or let the money corrupt them, or let the trauma define them. You did none of those things. You took what was meant to destroy you and built something beautiful with it. That's not just survival, Ilera. That's triumph." Maybe he was right. Maybe surviving Kalen Mercer, outlasting his cruelty, refusing to let him reduce her to nothing. Maybe that was its own kind of victory. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. Not the satisfying kind where the villain grovels and begs for forgiveness. Just the quiet kind where you wake up one day and realize you're happy, and the person who tried to break you is irrelevant. Irrelevance, Ilera had learned, was the perfect punishment for someone like Kalen. He'd spent his whole life demanding attention, demanding respect, demanding to be seen as important. Now he was just a number in a prison system, a cautionary tale in business schools, a footnote in someone else's story about survival and justice. And Ilera? She was free. Free to raise her son in a house full of love instead of cold marble and colder hearts. Free to do work that mattered instead of attending parties designed to impress people who didn't care. Free to build a legacy that had nothing to do with the man who tried to destroy her and everything to do with the man who'd saved her by believing she deserved better. Young Rowan came running up, his hands full of dandelions he'd picked like they were precious gems. "Mama, look, I got you flowers." Ilera took them with the seriousness they deserved, held them like they were roses from the finest garden. "They're perfect," she said. "Should we put them in water?" "Yes. And then can we have cookies?" Mrs. Chun said, "Maybe if you said yes." "Mrs. Chun is very wise," Ilera said, scooping him up despite the fact that he was getting too big for scooping. "Let's go have cookies." She carried him toward the house, this boy who would grow up knowing nothing but love and security, who would never understand what it meant to be used or discarded or set on fire because someone decided you were inconvenient. He would grow up with a Mercer name, but none of the Mercer cruelty, with wealth but also values, with power but also compassion. That was the real revenge, Alara thought, not the trial or the conviction or the 35-year sentence. The real revenge was raising a child who would be everything Kaylin had failed to become, in a house built on everything Kaylin had tried to destroy. Behind her, the sun set over the estate that had once represented someone else's empire. But the empire was gone now, transformed into something that actually mattered. And Alara Hayes, formerly Alara Mercer, walked into her home with her son in her arms and dandelions in her hands, and not a single regret about the man rotting in a prison cell who'd thought he could erase her from existence. She'd done more than survive him. She'd become the ghost that haunted every moment of his miserable life. The living proof that cruelty doesn't win, that love outlasts hate, that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply living well. What did you think of Alara's journey from victim to victor? Could you have forgiven someone like Kaylin, or was irrelevance the perfect punishment? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you think justice really looks like. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think about the power of surviving against impossible odds, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of quiet triumph over cruelty. Hit that like button if you believe that living well is truly the best revenge. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do to someone who tried to erase you is to keep existing, keep thriving, and keep building a life so beautiful they can't touch it from wherever they've fallen. Thank you for being part of our family. Your support means everything. Until the next story, remember that you're stronger than whatever tried to break you, and your story isn't over until you decide it is. See you in the next one.